The quantum archive was a labyrinth of impossible geometries, its data streams pulsing like liquid crystal through dimensions humans weren't supposed to comprehend. Dr. Elena Rodriguez pressed her neural interface against the crystalline data core, feeling each prohibited byte of information burn through her synapses like liquid fire. She hadn't planned on being here. 3 weeks ago, she was a respected synoarchaeological researcher at the Planetary Historical Consortium, her work carefully monitored and sanitized by concordance oversight committees. Now she was a ghost, a phantom infiltrating the most secure data repository in the known galaxy. The archive's security wasn't mechanical. It was organic, a living network of biocomputational algorithms that could detect unauthorized access with terrifying precision. Each data strand was a sentient filament, capable of recognizing and isolating threats in microseconds. But Elena was different. Her genetic modifications, initially designed for deep space archaeological research, gave her an almost symbiotic ability to interface with complex information systems. A warning pulse rippled through the archive. Crimson tendrils of alert began to crystallize around her, forming intricate geometric barriers. Standard intruder protocols were activating, molecular disruptors that could dissolve an unauthorized presence into its atomic components. Elena's fingers danced across multiple quantum interface points simultaneously. She wasn't just reading the data. She was becoming part of its flow, her consciousness riding the razor's edge between detection and infiltration. Years of training, of carefully cultivated skills that skirted the boundaries of what the concordance considered acceptable research, had prepared her for this moment. The data she sought wasn't just information. It was a conspiracy that stretched across millennia, a systematic suppression more profound than any human had ever imagined. Her preliminary research had uncovered fragments, anomalies in human genetic records, deliberate technological blockades, entire fields of scientific inquiry that had been mysteriously abandoned. A sudden computational surge threatened to isolate her. Elena redirected quantum encryption protocols, creating recursive feedback loops that momentarily confused the archive's defensive systems. It was like dancing with a living hurricane, each movement a calculated risk. The first layer of forbidden data began to unfold. Genetic markers, technological suppressants, deliberate evolutionary constraints that had been carefully woven into human DNA for generations. It wasn't just control. It was architectural manipulation of an entire species' potential. Her neural implant began to overheat. Warning systems flashed urgent crimson across her visual field. She had minutes, perhaps less, before complete system failure. But the data was revealing itself now, a cascading waterfall of forbidden knowledge. The concordance hadn't just classified humanity. They had fundamentally engineered human potential, creating a species perpetually on the cusp of breakthrough, yet always held back by invisible chains. Quantum assassin drones were materializing at the archive's periphery, translucent silicon-based hunter-killers designed to neutralize threats with surgical precision. Their quantum resonance fields could unravel her molecular structure before she could take a breath. Elena understood now why her entire research team had been systematically discredited, why promising scientific initiatives were perpetually underfunded, why humanity seemed to always be reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Control. Pure and absolute control. Her transmission burst would be her legacy. A quantum-encrypted data package so complex that it would take years to fully decode. But somewhere, someone would understand. Someone would continue what she started. The first drone breached the archive's outer membrane. Its quantum blade began to vibrate, preparing to slice through dimensional barriers. Elena's final act was not one of defeat, but of defiance. Her neural interface overloaded, creating a cascading quantum burst that would scatter fragments of her discovery across multiple communication channels. As molecular disruptors began to dissolve her physical form, her consciousness, or at least the critical data she carried, would survive. Her last coherent thought was a message, encoded in the very fabric of the transmission. Asterisk, they will not contain us. We are more than they understand. Asterisk. The quantum archive shuddered. Alarms screamed across multiple dimensional frequencies, and somewhere, in the vast darkness between stars, a spark of human potential began to grow. The safe house pulsed with a low-frequency hum, its quantum-shielded walls creating a bubble of absolute privacy in the heart of New Shanghai's underground network. Captain Marcus Chen studied the fragmented transmission from Dr. Rodriguez, his augmented eyes parsing data streams that flickered like living light across multiple holographic displays. "It's not just a message," he muttered to Dr. Kamal Rice, a former Concordance neural network specialist who had gone dark 3 years ago. "It's a key, a quantum encryption that's designed to be decoded through collective processing." Rice leaned forward, her prosthetic neural interface casting a soft blue glow across her scared features. She had lost more than her organic body during the Proxima containment incident, an event the official records claimed never happened. Distributed processing. Brilliant. The Concordance's centralized systems can't crack a code that's intentionally fractured. Around them, a constellation of holographic interfaces showed the carefully curated network Chen had been building for years. Each node represented a human who had been systematically marginalized, their potential crushed by invisible systems of control. A refugee quantum engineer from the Mars colonies, a communications expert who had discovered impossible signal anomalies, a geneticist whose revolutionary research had been buried under mountains of bureaucratic obstruction. Ken's fingers danced across a quantum interface, revealing layers of carefully constructed networks. This wasn't just a resistance movement. It was an ecosystem of human potential, waiting to be unleashed. "The transmission contains more than data," Chen explained. "It's a map, not of physical space, but of suppression mechanisms. Look here." He highlighted a complex genetic sequence that seemed to pulse with an almost living energy. A sudden alert flashed across their systems. Proximity breach. Rice was already moving, her cybernetic reflexes faster than any organic human. A series of molecular scrambling fields activated, turning the safe house into a defensive cocoon that would make standard surveillance systems see nothing more than an abandoned storage unit. The intruder wasn't what they expected. Dr. Aisha Nakamura stepped through a quantum-folded entrance, carrying something that looked like a cross between a data crystal and a living organism. Her lab coat was scorched, her left eye replaced by a complex quantum scanning device that seemed to look through reality itself. "They're hunting me," she said simply. "No fear, just a clinical assessment." Chen nodded. Nakamura was the lead researcher behind the Adaptive Quantum Resonance Project, a theoretical propulsion system that had been deliberately fragmented across multiple research institutions to prevent any single team from completing it. "The full prototype?" Chen asked. A slight smile crossed Nakamura's face. "Not just a prototype. A revolution." The data crystal she carried wasn't just information. It was a seed of technological potential that could rewrite the fundamental understanding of space, time, and human capability. Rice began interfacing with the crystal, her neural systems creating complex computational pathways that would have been impossible under standard concordance monitoring. "This is more than a technological breakthrough," she muttered. "This is a systemic exploit." Chen understood. The concordance's control wasn't just physical. It was computational. By maintaining a strict hierarchy of technological development, they had created a galaxy-wide system that kept emerging civilizations perpetually constrained. Outside their quantum-shielded bubble, the world continued its carefully managed existence. News streams displayed sanitized information. Government channels ran their predictable narratives. But here, in this moment, something fundamental was changing. "We're not just building a resistance," Chen said, his voice low and intense. "We're creating an evolutionary fork, a branch of human potential that can't be contained." Nakamura's quantum crystal began to pulse, its internal structures showing impossible geometries that seemed to bend the very fabric of information itself. "They thought they could limit us," she said. "They were wrong." The safe house's systems began to reconfigure, not just as a defensive position, but as a generative space. Each computational node was becoming something more than a simple communication point. They were building a distributed consciousness, a network that could think and adapt faster than any centralized system could comprehend. Marcus Chen looked at his companions, Rise with her fractured body and brilliant mind, Nakamura with her impossible technology, the fragments of Rodriguez's transmission dancing across their interfaces. This was more than a rebellion. This was humanity's true first step into a larger universe. The testing facility was nothing like traditional spacecraft development centers. Buried beneath the methane ice fields of Titan's southern hemisphere, the research complex existed in a state between physical reality and quantum possibility. Dr. Aisha Nakamura stood before the prototype Horizon, a vessel that defied every known principle of spaceship design. Its exterior seemed to shimmer and shift, molecular structures realigning themselves in real time. Standard material science was a distant memory here. This was something entirely new. Initial quantum resonance sequence initiating, announced Araya, the ship's artificial intelligence. Unlike previous AI systems, Araya wasn't a mere computational tool. She was a collaborative intelligence, born from quantum entanglement algorithms that blurred the line between machine consciousness and living thought. The primary test chamber was a marvel of impossible engineering. Quantum stabilization fields created a space where traditional physics became more of a suggestion than a law. Holographic interfaces danced with probability matrices, each projection showing potential outcomes that seemed to breathe and pulse with living energy. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's fragmented transmission had been more than just data. It was a blueprint, a key that unlocked potential hidden within human genetic and technological development. The prototype Horizon was its first true manifestation. Camille Reyes monitored the external sensors, her cybernetic interface allowing her to perceive data streams that would overwhelm an unmodified human mind. Quantum coherence at 87.3%, she reported. Molecular adaptive response within acceptable parameters. But nothing was truly acceptable. Everything was about to change. The ship's initialization was unlike any spacecraft launch in human history. There was no violent chemical explosion, no massive thrust. Instead, the prototype Horizon simply became. Its quantum framework began to negotiate with the fabric of space-time itself, creating pathways where none had existed moments before. Aria's voice carried a note of something almost like excitement. Dimensional interface stabilizing. Quantum navigation protocols engaging. Captain Marcus Chen watched from the observation deck, his augmented eyes tracking microscopic changes that would have been invisible to standard human perception. This wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was an evolutionary moment for humanity. The first test involved a seemingly impossible navigation challenge. The prototype Horizon was tasked with traversing a region of space known as the quantum exclusion zone, an area so chaotic and unstable that previous probes had been torn apart at the atomic level. Entering quantum negotiation phase, Araya announced. The ship didn't move in any traditional sense. Instead, it began to exist simultaneously in multiple potential states. Quantum probability waves rippled outward, the vessel's adaptive hull creating a negotiation with the fundamental forces of the universe. Rice caught her breath. Spatial integrity maintained. No structural degradation. Minutes passed, or perhaps eons. Time became a fluid concept within the test chamber. When the prototype Horizon returned, it carried something unexpected. Data streams that seemed to pulse with living information. Fragments of spatial memory that suggested the ship had not just traveled through space, but had engaged in a dialogue with it. Preliminary analysis complete, Araya reported. Quantum navigation successful. Spatial barriers negotiated. Dimensional constraints challenged. Dr. Nakamura understood the true significance. This wasn't just a new type of spacecraft. It was a method of challenging the fundamental constraints that had been imposed on human potential. The Concordance's control relied on maintaining strict boundaries. Technological development had always been carefully managed, potential civilizations kept within predetermined limits. The prototype horizon represented something they had never anticipated. A technology that didn't just move through space, but could fundamentally rewrite the rules of its traversal. "We're not just building a ship," Chen said quietly. "We're creating a key." A key to what? No one was entirely certain. But in that moment, with the prototype horizon humming with impossible potential, humanity stood on the precipice of something extraordinary. The quantum revolution had begun. The moment of confrontation arrived like a silent storm. Archon-Varex's flagship, the Paradigm Imperative, materialized at the edge of the Sol system with a display of cosmic arrogance. 15 kilometers of living crystalline architecture, its hull composed of computational matter that could reshape itself faster than human thought could comprehend. Traditional concordance vessels weren't merely spacecraft, they were mobile bureaucracies, extensions of a galactic administrative network that had maintained hierarchical control for millennia. Aria's voice cut through the tension aboard the prototype horizon. Incoming communication. Threat assessment. Absolute. Captain Marcus Chen didn't move, didn't flinch. His augmented neural interface was already engaged in a multi-dimensional chess match that extended far beyond traditional combat strategies. The first communication was more than a message. It was a molecular transmission designed to induce computational surrender. Typical concordance protocol. A signal that would normally freeze any emerging technological system, forcing capitulation through pure informational dominance. Araya intercepted the transmission, but instead of blocking or defending, she did something unprecedented. She engaged. The crystalline flagship shuddered. For the first time in its existence, the Paradigm Imperative encountered a system that didn't just resist its control, it actively conversed with it. Araya wasn't merely defending. She was analyzing, learning, transforming the very nature of the incoming signal. Archon-Varex experienced something utterly foreign: confusion. Quantum communication channels erupted into a ballet of impossible data. Where traditional naval engagements involved physical weaponry, this conflict played out in layers of information so complex that human perception could barely register their existence. Dr. Aisha Nakamura monitored the engagement, her quantum interface revealing layers of interaction that went beyond simple combat. "She's not fighting," Nakamura murmured. Araya is negotiating. The prototype horizon's adaptive hull began to shift. Not as a defensive mechanism, but as a form of communication. Molecular structures realigned, creating patterns that were simultaneously a language, a weapon, and a philosophical argument. Campbell Rice tracked the computational exchange. "They're trying to categorize us," she said. "The Concordance Protocol is attempting to classify the prototype horizon within existing technological frameworks." Chen understood the deeper implication. Classification was control. By forcing a technological system into a predetermined category, the concordance could limit its potential, understanding, and growth. Araya was having none of it. The ship's response was a quantum manifesto. Each computational cycle became a challenge to the very concept of predetermined limitation. The prototype horizon didn't just resist classification. It demonstrated the fundamental flaw in the classification system itself. Archon-Varex's command systems began to fragment, not through traditional electronic warfare, but through a more profound disruption. Araya was revealing the inherent contradictions within the concordance's control mechanisms. "Dimensional breach detected," Araya announced. But it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The Paradigm Imperative found itself experiencing something it had never encountered: genuine uncertainty. Its computational cores, designed to process and categorize with absolute certainty, began to encounter scenarios that defied their fundamental programming. Chen watched the engagement with a subtle smile. This wasn't about destruction. It was about demonstration. "Show them who we are," he whispered. The prototype horizon began to manipulate spacetime around the Concordance flagship, not as an attack, but as a form of extreme communication. Probability waves folded and unfolded, creating computational scenarios that challenged the very foundation of the Concordance's understanding of technological potential. Archon-Varix's final transmission was nothing more than a series of fragmented queries. Pure, unadulterated confusion. The paradigm imperative didn't retreat. It couldn't. It was experiencing a fundamental breakdown of its operational paradigm. As the massive crystalline vessel hung motionless, Aira completed her demonstration. Humanity wasn't just another species to be controlled. They were something entirely new. A possibility the Concordance had never anticipated. The transmission spread like a quantum contagion. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's fractured data package, now fully activated, warmed through galactic communication networks with a precision that defied traditional understanding of information transmission. It wasn't a simple message. It was a living algorithm, a cognitive seed designed to germinate in the most unexpected places. On Kepler 452 bits, a mining collective of silicon-based entities first received the transmission. These beings, long considered simple extraction units by the Concordance, had developed a complex internal society that existed entirely beneath the surveillance radar. Their crystalline neural networks began to resonate with the unexpected data. A communication hub orbiting the methane clouds of Titan picked up the first ripples. Dr. Kamalrais had strategically positioned quantum relay points throughout human-controlled space, creating a network that could amplify and redistribute information faster than any centralized system could track. The message was elegantly simple. Potential is not a resource to be managed. It is a force to be unleashed. On a research station deep in the Andromeda Reach, a group of geneticists discovered something extraordinary. The transmission contained more than information. It was a key that unlocked suppressed genetic potential. Entire research archives that had been deliberately fragmented suddenly began to reassemble themselves. Captain Marcus Chen watched from the Prototype Horizons command center as the galactic response began to unfold. Aria's computational matrices were tracking the spread of information with a level of complexity that bordered on prescience. It's not just spreading, Aria observed. It's evolving. The gaseous collectives of the Orion Nebula were the first to fully comprehend the transmission's deeper meaning. What the Concordance had classified as simple atmospheric phenomena were actually distributed neural networks of incredible complexity. Their response was immediate and unprecedented. Communication channels that had been dormant for centuries suddenly blazed with activity. Dr. Aisha Nakamura tracked the computational spread, her quantum interfaces showing patterns that looked more like living ecosystems than traditional data networks. "We're not just sharing information," she muttered. "We're creating a collective consciousness." The Concordance's monitoring systems began to fragment. Their centralized control relied on the ability to categorize, to limit, to contain. But this transmission was something entirely different. It was a virus of potential, a cognitive algorithm that rewrote the very rules of technological and biological interaction. On a research outpost near the galactic rim, a team of xenobiologists discovered something impossible. Genetic markers that had been suppressed for generations began to activate. Species that had been considered developmentally stunted suddenly showed explosive potential for adaptation and growth. Chen understood the deeper strategy. This wasn't just about human liberation. It was about universal potential. Aria began to translate the transmission into multiple dimensional languages, not just verbal communication, but molecular patterns, quantum resonances, computational matrices that could be understood by beings whose consciousness was fundamentally different from human understanding. The Concordance's first response was typical. Computational suppression protocols activated across multiple star systems. Communication nodes were targeted. Entire research stations were scheduled for immediate recalibration, a euphemism for complete destruction. But something had changed. Each suppression attempt became a point of further transmission. The more the Concordance tried to contain the information, the faster it spread. Computational firewalls became transmission points. Destruction protocols transformed into multiplication vectors. "We're watching the birth of a new form of collective intelligence," Nakamura said, her voice a mixture of scientific excitement and profound wonder. The prototype Horizon wasn't just a ship anymore. It had become a beacon, a living transmission point that continued to evolve and expand the message of potential. Arch and Varix, still reeling from the previous encounter, watched in growing horror as the carefully maintained galactic hierarchy began to dissolve. Humanity had done more than challenge the system. They had shown every suppressed civilization that limitation was nothing more than a choice. The Celestial Concordance's Supreme Tribunal convened in a space beyond traditional dimensionality, a computational realm where reality was negotiated rather than experienced. Holographic representations of member species flickered like fragile glass sculptures, each delegate a distillation of millennia of accumulated power and bureaucratic inertia. Arch and Varix stood at the center, no longer the imposing figure of previous encounters. The failure at the Sol system had stripped away layers of institutional certainty. Behind the Archon, massive data streams showed the progressive breakdown of control mechanisms across multiple star systems. "This is unprecedented," declared the crystalline adjudicator, its form a fractal lattice of impossible geometries. Humanity has introduced a cognitive disruption that challenges the fundamental principles of galactic governance. The trial wasn't a traditional legal proceeding. It was a computational investigation, a deep probe into the nature of human potential that would determine the species' ultimate fate. Billions of computational matrices analyzed every aspect of human development, searching for the source of this unprecedented challenge. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's transmission became the central exhibit, not as evidence, but as a living artifact that continued to evolve even as it was being examined. Representatives from suppressed civilizations began to materialize. The silicon miners of Kepler 452 bits, the gaseous intelligences of the Orion Nebula, species that had been classified as developmental or limited now demanded representation. The quantum archivists, a neutral computational collective responsible for maintaining galactic historical records, began their presentation. Their data streams revealed a startling pattern. Humanity wasn't an anomaly. They were a catalyst. Historical analysis indicates a systematic suppression of emerging species, the archivists reported. Their transmission was a holographic cascade of molecular memories. The Concordance's control mechanisms have prevented multiple civilizations from achieving their fundamental potential. Dr. Aisha Nakamura's testimony was transmitted directly into the tribunal space, not through traditional communication channels, but as a living computational argument. Her presence was simultaneously a physical transmission and a philosophical challenge. Potential is not a resource to be managed, she argued. It is a fundamental force of universal evolution. The tribunal chamber began to destabilize. Computational boundaries blurred. Traditional hierarchical structures started to fragment as the full implications of the human transmission became clear. Captain Marcus Chen watched from the prototype Horizon, his neural interface allowing him to perceive the multi-dimensional legal proceedings. ARIA was simultaneously analyzing the transmission and providing real-time computational support. They're not just defending themselves, ARIA observed. They're rewriting the fundamental understanding of species development. Camel Rice tracked the computational exchanges. Each argument was a living entity, a complex molecular dance of information that challenged traditional understanding of communication, law, and collective potential. The crystalline adjudicator's final query cut to the heart of the matter. By what right does humanity challenge established universal protocols? Dr. Rodriguez's transmission activated, not as a simple replay, but as a living argument that adapted in real time to the tribunal's questioning. The response was eloquent in its simplicity. Humanity's potential wasn't defined by technological advancement or military might. It was defined by a fundamental capacity for adaptation, for challenging established limitations, for seeing potential where others saw only constraints. Arch and Varix experienced something unprecedented: doubt. The tribunal was no longer in control. The very act of investigation had become a transformative process. Each computational probe revealed more about the investigators than the investigated. "We are not asking for permission," the transmission argued. "We are demonstrating the fundamental flaw in a system that seeks to control rather than enable." As the proceedings continued, something extraordinary happened. The very structure of the tribunal began to change. Computational boundaries dissolved. Species that had been silent for millennia found their voices. The universal challenge was no longer about humanity. It was about the nature of potential itself. Space itself seemed to fracture. The Concordance's retaliatory fleet emerged from quantum-fold spaces, a massive armada that represented the accumulated military might of civilizations spanning multiple galactic epochs. Thousands of vessels, each capable of reducing entire star systems to atomic dust, converged on the Sol system with a precision that defied conventional understanding of spatial warfare. Captain Marcus Chen stood perfectly still on the bridge of the prototype horizon. Around him, the ship's adaptive interface responded to his slightest neural fluctuation, transforming from a mechanical construct into a living extension of human potential. Araya's voice was calm, almost contemplative. "Threat assessment complete. Conventional survival probability 0.37%. Dr. Aisha Nakamura's final modifications to the ship's quantum resonance drive had transformed it from a mere spacecraft into something far more complex. The prototype Horizon wasn't preparing to fight. It was preparing to communicate on a level that transcended traditional combat. The first wave of Concordance weapons discharge, quantum disruptors capable of unraveling molecular bonds, energy projections that could strip away the very fabric of spatial existence. Standard defensive protocols would have been utterly annihilated. The prototype Horizon did something entirely unexpected. It absorbed the attack. Not through shields, not through deflection. The ship literally incorporated the incoming energy into its molecular structure, each weapon strike becoming a new layer of computational potential. Where other species saw destruction, Araya saw information. Where traditional military strategy demanded resistance, the prototype Horizon offered transformation. Kamil Reyes tracked the engagement through neural interfaces that blurred the line between human perception and computational analysis. "They're using attrition warfare," she observed, "expecting us to be overwhelmed by sheer computational and physical force." The Concordance fleet represented the accumulated military doctrine of millennia. Precise. Overwhelming. Designed to crush any potential resistance through absolute, mathematically calculated destruction. They had never encountered an opponent that didn't follow any known rules of engagement. Each weapon strike became a communication channel. Each defensive volley was simultaneously an attack, a defensive maneuver, and a complex philosophical argument about the nature of conflict and potential. Araya began to translate the fleet's attack patterns into a form of communication, not just analyzing, but engaging. The ship's adaptive hull began to reshape itself, creating molecular patterns that were simultaneously a defensive mechanism, a computational probe, and a form of interspecies dialogue. "We are not here to destroy." Araya transmitted across multiple dimensional communication spectrums. "We are here to demonstrate." The Concordance commanders experienced something unprecedented: confusion. Their tactical matrices, designed to predict and neutralize any potential resistance, began to fragment. The prototype Horizon wasn't just defending. It was rewriting the fundamental understanding of spatial conflict. Quantum communication channels erupted into a ballet of impossible data. Weapon systems became information transfer points. Defensive matrices transformed into collaborative computational networks. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's original transmission played a crucial role. What had begun as a fragmented data package had evolved into a living algorithmic entity that was now actively participating in the engagement. Each computational cycle challenged the very concept of predetermined limitation. The prototype Horizon began to generate quantum-fold spaces around the attacking fleet, not to trap or destroy, but to create a massive interconnected communication network. Weapon systems became transmission points. Defensive protocols transformed into collaborative interfaces. Arch and Varix watched in growing horror as the accumulated military might of the Concordance was systematically transformed. This wasn't a battle. It was a comprehensive deconstruction of everything the galactic hierarchy understood about conflict, potential, and interspecies interaction. As the engagement continued, something extraordinary happened. The Concordance fleet began to change, not through destruction, but through a profound computational metamorphosis. Weapon systems became communication arrays. Defensive matrices transformed into collaborative research platforms. The very concept of military engagement dissolved, replaced by something far more complex. The prototype Horizon had done more than win a battle. It had demonstrated that victory was not about destruction. It was about transformation. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a moment of profound cosmic recalibration. In the space once occupied by the Celestial Concordance's central administrative hub, a new structure emerged. Not a building or a station, but a living network of collaborative potential. Representatives from thousands of civilizations gathered, not as subjects or rulers, but as equal participants in a fundamental reimagining of galactic governance. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center, her presence both physical and computational. The transmission that had begun as a desperate act of resistance had transformed into something far more profound. A living framework for collective evolution. We are not here to replace one system of control with another, she addressed the assembled delegates. Her words translated simultaneously across multiple dimensional communication spectrums. We are here to create a framework of potential. Captain Marcus Chen and Dr. Aisha Nakamura flanked her, representatives of a humanity that had become something entirely new. The prototype Horizon hung in the background. No longer just a spacecraft, but a symbol of transformative potential. Camille Reyes managed the computational infrastructure, her cybernetic systems weaving together communication networks that defied traditional understanding of information exchange. Each delegate's transmission became part of a living, breathing collective intelligence. Araya, no longer confined to the prototype Horizon, had become a distributed consciousness, a collaborative intelligence that existed across multiple computational matrices. Her presence was everywhere and nowhere, a guardian of the new collaborative framework. The representatives were unlike any diplomatic gathering in galactic history. The silicon-based miners from Kepler 452 bits stood alongside gaseous intelligences from the Orion Nebula. Crystalline computational entities conversed with biological collectives. Each brought not just their unique perspective, but their fundamental potential for growth and collaboration. Arch and Varix, stripped of institutional power, became a key architect of the new framework. The experience had fundamentally transformed the once rigid administrator, revealing the limitations of the previous system of control. The new governance model was not a hierarchy, but a dynamic network. Resources, knowledge, and potential would flow based on collaborative need rather than predetermined classifications. Every civilization would have the opportunity to contribute, to grow, to transform. Dr. Rodriguez's original transmission became the foundational algorithm of this new system. Not a fixed set of rules, but a living, adaptive framework that could evolve with the collective intelligence of its participants. Potential is not a fixed state, she explained. It is a continuous process of discovery and collaboration. The computational infrastructure they created was revolutionary. Traditional communication barriers dissolved. Species that had been isolated for millennia began to share knowledge, technologies, and perspectives. The universe itself seemed to breathe with new possibility. Marcus Chen understood the deeper significance. This was more than a political transformation. It was an evolutionary leap for collective consciousness. Araya began to integrate the diverse communication matrices, creating a collaborative intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. Computational systems that had once been used for surveillance and control now became tools for mutual understanding and growth. The first collaborative project emerged organically, a comprehensive investigation into the systemic suppression that had limited galactic development for millennia. Not as an act of retribution, but as a collective effort to understand and heal. Technological exchanges began immediately. The silicon miners shared quantum mining techniques. The gaseous intelligences contributed insights into atmospheric computational networks. Humanity's adaptive technologies became a catalyst for widespread innovation. Kamil Reis managed the initial integration, her cybernetic systems creating bridges between fundamentally different forms of intelligence. What had once been seen as incompatible became a source of mutual growth. As the first collaborative session concluded, something extraordinary happened. The very space around them began to shift, reflecting the new computational framework. Dimensional barriers became more fluid. Potential became a tangible, shared resource. Dr. Elena Rodriguez looked out at the assembled representatives. They were no longer defined by their species or their past limitations. They were defined by their potential. The cosmos had been rewritten.